In this video, I will show you how to create constraints in SQL Server. The first type of constraint that will come up is the constraints that are created when you build an ER diagram in SQL Server. And constraints in general, just like building a database, can be done either with the graphic user interface, buttons and toolbars in SQL Server, or they can be done with code. So the first thing we'll do is build the ER diagram in SQL Server, which of course will be done using the interface. So here I am in SQL Server, and I've already imported the tables, and I've checked to confirm that the tables are clean. And so what I'm going to do is go to the Database Diagrams folder, and I'm going to right-click and create a new database diagram. And here are the three tables. I'm going to add each one of these and close. And the tables I have are product and category, and a junction table, product category. So the idea is that there is a many-to-many relationship between product and category, because in my business I want to be able to double or triple categorize a product. So for one product there can be many categories, and of course for one category there can be many products. All right, so the first thing that I want to do is I want to set the primary keys. So I'm going to go to each one of these fields and right-click and set the primary keys. When I do this, you can see that stars are added to these tables. That means they're unsaved. I've made changes, but they haven't been saved yet. And as I make changes, I may want to stop and save, and actually haven't even saved the diagram yet. So I'm going to hit the Save button, and I'll call this ERD Product Category. And it tells me it's about to save those tables. And so as I make changes, I may want to stop and save, because if I do get an error message, I'll know that the error I'm receiving, corresponds to the most recent changes. All right, so down here in product category, this I'm using a sort of surrogate key for the primary key, so I'm going to indicate that. Same thing, there's the star, and I can just come up and hit the Save button. It tells me it's about to save those changes, that table, because it had changes, and it saves them successfully. So what I'm doing right here is I'm indicating these primary keys. If you took a SQL class, you may have used the diagram here really just as a roadmap for information about how the tables relate to each other. But you can also use this ER diagram to create the actual relationships, and of course in this case create primary keys for those different tables. When you do that, you are actually creating constraints. So primary key is a kind of constraint. And when I create that, when I right-click and I indicate primary key, that is a constraint. One thing you can do too is you can come over here and take a look. I'm going to hit the F5 key to refresh. If I go to tables and I go, for example, to the product table and I go to keys, I can see that the primary key here has been created. So I could do something down here to create the primary key, but it's much easier, of course, to come here and just right-click to create that key. I could also do this with code as well. So there's a couple of ways I could set this up. All right, I'm going to collapse this, and I'm going to continue using the diagram to create further constraints. Now the next thing I want to do is create the join lines to show how the tables relate. This will also create a constraint, because when I create a join line, it creates what's called a foreign key constraint. So what I want to do is I want to drag from primary key to the corresponding foreign key down here. Now it's really important that I come here and I click on that little gray square there where the primary key is, and I drag down to the corresponding foreign key. Now the line may not be accurate, but my mouse has to be. I have to be right on that gray square. And when I let go, it's really important to read this and make sure that I got on the right square, the right part of that gray square. If it's blank or I have the wrong field, I have to redo this. So it's coming from the product table, and it's the product ID, and the foreign key is in the product category table, also the product ID. So that's correct. I'm going to click OK. and I get an error. So I purposely set up a couple of errors because this could happen to you. And the error I'm getting here is about data types. So I'm going to click OK, and I'm going to cancel out of here. So the data types are not set correctly. And this is something you want to be careful about. Data types, you want to make sure your data is logical in how you've set it up. So I'm going to show you what I did purposely. So the data types have to match between primary key and foreign key. Now I had set the product ID and category ID to integer, but I didn't set product ID and category ID down here to be integer as well. I left them on the default, and when they were imported they were set to float. So all I'm going to have to do is right click on that product category table, go to design, and you can see these are float, but I'm going to change them to int. Okay, so now they'll match their corresponding primary key. I'm also going to change this one up here to int. And save and close. Okay, now I'm going to try this again. So I go from product ID down to product ID here. I very carefully read this dialog box, make sure it's accurate, click OK, and you can see there are those stars there, and I'm going to hit the save button. It tells me it's about to save the changes in those two tables, and I'll say yes, and success. It did it without any error messages. Okay, now I'm going to do the other one. So I'm going to go from category ID down to the corresponding foreign key here, category ID. And again, I read this very carefully. Click OK and OK. And there it is. The join lines don't automatically, go where they're supposed to. You can sort of move them around if you want to, but it just doesn't happen automatically in SQL Server. Now I'm going to go ahead and hit save. And it tells me it's going to make changes to these two tables. And I get another error message, and this one's a little different. This is a violation of the foreign key constraint. And let me explain what this means. And you really want to read these so you know what the error is. So the problem is, and I set this up, I have categories, and my categories are categories 1, 2, and 3. But over here in my junction table, I didn't enter categories 1, 2, and 3. I have categories 101, 102, 103, so they're different numbers. And I notice people do that sometimes when they're creating their data tables. They're not consistent. If you create a category, or you're creating buses and the bus numbers are 1, 2, and 3, when you schedule those buses in your schedule table or your junction table, you'd better be scheduling using those same numbers, 1, 2, and 3. You can't change your mind and say, well, now I'm going to call the buses A, B, and C. Another way to think of this is you can't have a record in a many table that does not have, with a reference to a record or a key that does not exist in the one table. So for example, I can't have category 103 if I don't already have category 103 defined here. All right, so I'm going to have to delete this relationship temporarily. And then I'm going to go ahead and open up these tables to show you what is happening. So here are my categories, and I have categories 1, 2, 3. And here is the junction table, and you can see I categorized, but I used these random category IDs that don't exist in the category table, 101, 102, etc. So these really should be 1, this one should be 2, this should be a 1, and this should be a 3. All right. So I fixed the data. You want to be really careful about that too. Make sure your data is logical and doesn't violate that foreign key constraint. So the primary key, the foreign key, they have to match in data type, and the data, of course, has to match. The data in the many side must exist in the one side of the relationship. All right, now that I fixed up the data, I can drag this again from primary key to foreign key, double check, click OK, and save changes. And the key is to save changes. Right now you might say, oh, great, it worked, it's fine. Nope, if you see stars there on those tables and you haven't saved, you don't know if it's working yet. So I'm going to come up here and hit the save button, says it's going to save these two tables, and success, I've got it. I can move the join around if I want to, but really it's behind scenes. It knows what fields are related. All right, that's it for building constraints using the diagram.